Hello, everyone. This is Master Victor Neustruev, and thank you for coming to our workshop. Today, we are going to talk about transitioning to the end game when we have equal or approximately equal material. So we're going to talk about what are these objectives to transition to the end game. Well, how do we realize our advantage? And also how we defend our position. If, for example, we see that playing the end game is the best way for us to save the game. Okay, so I see that new participants are joining our event. So guys, can you please introduce yourself a little? For example, which country you're from and what's your rating? It can be either FIDE rating, your national rating, or chess.com or Chess rating. So we are about to start soon in a few minutes. I prepared 5 examples for you, and soon we are going to discuss when it does make sense to pass the game to the end game. I'm sure everything is fine with the sound and video quality. Okay, so Zamfir is not for the first time here, so he joins very often. From Romania, almost 2,000. Very good. Okay, so perfect. We have also a very strong chess player from the United States. His chess.com rating is 2240. Wow, it's great. And national is below 2000. Okay, fine. If anybody else wants to share, you're welcome. Well, if not, you can do it later. Let's start. Okay, so first of all, well, we are going to talk about passing the game to the end game when it does make sense. So what are we going to get with when we want to pass the game to the game? Well, for example, if we want to realize our advantage and we believe that the best way or the simplest way to do it is in the end game, then we may pass the game to the end game. When we want to neutralize the enemy activity, why not? For example, also when by doing the transition to the end game, we eliminate enemy dangerous pieces. If, for example, the enemy dangerous piece is a queen, and when we want to clarify the position, we want to clarify the situation, well, mainly when we want to simplify. Okay, let's start with this example. This game was played, no, let me see, in 1912. Yes, it's in his earlier career. So it was Alexander Alekhine playing against Osip Bernstein. So what do you think Black should do? Black pieces are well placed. There is a pressure in the center. So maybe we would love to have this pawn on f7 and the queen somewhere else, but looks like it's not a big issue. So knight c3 leads to complication, but this move should be well calculated. So knight c3, queen c3, bishop e4, and looks like we won a piece. Oh, we won a pawn on c3. Yeah, that's right. Also, knight c3, they can react with such move. Well, something like that is unlikely to work because we take on b1 and then we're threatening to escape with our knight, capturing the other pawn. So they either have to take immediately on c3 or they have to take on g6 and sacrifice this bishop for a pawn. This makes sense too. This is what actually was played in the game. Let me explain. So definitely knight c3 is the best move, having in mind that the queen is overloaded. So knight c3. Well, queen e5 is a double attack. Let me see. Queen a5 is a double attack. Well, yeah, what they take, they take on e7. There is no double attack, and the bishop can retreat there, or maybe there, or maybe there. All options are fine. So I think that queen e5 doesn't look so good. Knight c3, queen c3, bishop e4. Then what? Well, rook b2, for example. But if so, if rook b2 is played, here you can even gain the second pawn. Well, rook b2 is forced, actually, because the rook is hanging. It can be rook c1, of course, but rook b2 seems to be more a better place for the rook because the rook is more active. And then you also have a tactical strike. Who can find it? It's not queen d5, but queen d5 is a good idea because then queen g3, they can protect both. Bishop d3 is interesting, but what did you achieve with it? Are you going to take there? I think they will just retreat and save this pawn. Yes, then is correct. I think it's bishop. Yeah, bishop g2, of course. With bishop g2, we are threatening to take the enemy bishop by doing this fork. If queen d5 is played right away, there is a f4 no, this move, and bishop d4 looks suspicious. So rook d2, e5. Well, maybe it's okay. Knight e3. This is what I was thinking about. No, this looks okay. Queen d5. Queen d5 is fine too. Yeah, actually, bishop g2 is the simplest way. Well, queen d5, queen g3, queen d5, queen g3, and then you can take on d4. And that does make sense. I agree. So it's also a possible way to obtain advantage here. Fine. What else? This fails because we took a pawn, now we take a rook, and we are threatening to take the bishop. So if rook or queen takes, we simply take there, and we have extra exchange here. So they have to save the bishop. But if so, knight a3, and the knight is not trapped. We can play b4 and save it. Fine. So that's why what they have left. Bishop g6, trying to sacrifice the bishop for something, and then capturing on c3. For example, if knight b1 or knight d1 in this position, then bishop h7 with a tempo. So king goes there, and there is a strong attack with queen h5 and potentially a checkmate by doing queen h7. This is what they'd better avoid. So that's why in this position, instead of capturing on b1 and instead of capturing there, because capturing there means that there will be queen c3, right? Queen c3. Well, queen d5, this move. Bishop g2. If bishop g2, then which move? Maybe still queen g3 is fine, but it looks okay. So seems like h takes g6 works for black. But yes, queen d5 threatens much faster. However, then they definitely take on h7 and king h8 is a must. But the queen is overloaded. Once the queen takes, this bishop is lost. Plus, there is a double attack on g5 and g2. In order to defend, knight a3 doesn't work, right? Because knight a3 played means just queen g5. So f4. With f4, they protect with the queen, but again, the queen becomes overloaded. It has to do three functions at the same time. Knight b1, rook b1. So they took two pawns. We won one pawn in exchange. So we have extra exchange and they have one pawn as a compensation, but we take the second one and king h1. Now, what would you do? So the king is in the danger. This king is not really in the danger because, well, only bishop g2 is a problem, but there is always a queen guarding it. And in order to attack on the king side with black pieces, you have to bring your rooks to the game, which is not an easy task because how? The e file is closed. The sixth rank, no, it's impossible. The D file, but again, there is no square to invade the enemy camp. So here, Black understands that he is much better, but he wants to convert his advantage. Okay, so let me see. Is Queen G2 also okay instead of Queen D4? Good point, Queen G2. I think it is okay. This, well, H3 is hanging, so that's why they are likely to take. You take there. This is a hanging pawn. But they take on e7. But if they take on e7, you take on f4. Yes, it would be fine. I'm sure it would be fine. So let's go back. I think yes. But queen d4 with a check, it's so attractive. King h1. Does e5 work? Let's first talk about rook f4, Brian's suggestion. So sacrifice in exchange back. Okay, let me see. So, and what does it allow Black to play? I think it's still a winning position and this sacrifice makes sense, but the position becomes risky. So bishop g6, and if they can deliver the queen to h5, you have to block on h6 to avoid problems. Maybe bishop e5 here, but this is not a threat. So queen there. Well, I don't know, to be honest. I don't know. I'm sure black is better here. So here, queen h6 with queen h3 threat. That's right. That's right. It's possible. So bishop f5, for example. So it seems to me it's winning. Well, e5 is hanging actually. So maybe here queen h6. Mm, Bishop here anyway. So it seems to be winning, but mainly because of these pawns. So a5 and b4 should be played at some point to create a passed pawn. Well, rook f8 in this position, I don't think it's so attractive. What for? So rook b5, let's say. Queen g5, no, it's protected. So yeah, it's enough. So there is this move, queen at then rook f5, but it fails because of queen g5. So rook b5, and this is where white almost equalized. No, rook f8 is too how to say, too straightforward, and it doesn't work for such a complicated position. Yeah, so queen f5 is a possibility, but you want to trade queens because you think this king is in the danger. I actually thought that it would better for black to trade the queens there because of extra exchange. So the e7 is not vulnerable because f4 is. That's why playing this move leads to a trade of the queens, and then the game passes to the endgame. Right? Look at the position. What do you think? Why does e5? Oh, sorry, Erosh. Sorry. I forgot to check your line. Yeah, here, for example, if they reject, it's queen h3. Yeah, let's talk about e5. Well, why it doesn't work? I think it does work, but does it work so well as queen c3? Let me see. Let's say rook d1. Now there is no queen c3, so queen c5. I can try f5, maybe. Yeah, because king h7, f6. Probably there is a counterplay. like that. Not sure if it works. If these moves are with checks, then it works. Yeah, e5 doesn't seem so strong. Well, I think it's still possible to play this position, but we are trying to convert advantage. Well, so what I want my students to do, how I want them to play the games. I mean, uh, I want my students to win every single game. I don't want them obligatory to play like beautiful chess, to play combinations. I don't want them to like even enjoy the game. What I want is to win. I want them to win and progress. And if with winning and progressing, they are enjoying chess, it's great. So but well, you should understand what is better for you. For me, so winning the game, even if the game is not beautiful and doesn't contain tactics, is better than playing a good game with tons of tactical strikes, but that game ends in a draw, for example. So I'd better prefer to win, even if the position is calm, there is not much tactics, and so on, rather than getting any other result. So here, by doing rook f4 or by playing e5, the moves that are not bad, you can still win the game. But you make the position so complicated that you increase your risk to lose the game and miss something. Maybe your opponent also will, for example, in case of rook f4, bishop takes, queen takes, bishop f5, maybe he also can miss something and lose the game. But you increase your chances to lose. You increase your chances to blunder. However, if you play queen c3, he is forced to trade. Otherwise, it's queen h3. If it's not a checkmate on g2, at least he loses on h7 and the game will be over. And that's why I ask you to find such moves like queen c3 to pass the game to a winning endgame and simply realize it without any complications, without any trouble problems, and without risk to lose. So this will improve your performance. And if your performance is improved, you are more likely to increase your rating and enjoy chess, seeing that you are progressing. Okay, so queen c3. Well, how did they play? They either trade or they play king h2. They decided to play king h2 in this position. So queen c2, bishop c2, e5. Trading a weak pawn for the pawn on f4. It also allows the rook to invade the enemy camp. That's the reason why in this game they played f5. They didn't want more files to become open and didn't want the rook's invasion. Okay, this is the end game. Most likely it's winning endgame, which is seen by naked eye, but how to win? What's the plan? Well, a5 before is definitely the plan. Should you start with this move right away? So activate the king and playing bishop f6 exchanging. Yeah, that's right. So first of all, you should, well, this is a winning plan, obviously. But in order to initiate this plan, you have to prepare your pieces for that. How? Make more files open for your rooks to be able to let them join in case if it's required. For example, if your pawns are stuck. Also, you shouldn't let the enemy pieces to attack your pieces, which would make some vulnerabilities in your position. For example, if your, let's say, this is under attack of the bishop, then where do you move it? To b7, it blocks this bishop. To b6, again, it can be under attack. And if you move it away, you lose on b5. So this is what we want to avoid. That's why we are starting to trade enemy dangerous, potentially even dangerous pieces. Bishop f6, rook f6. Knight goes to e3. So they defend, they threaten to go there. But a5. So a5, maybe consider it like a mistake because you blunder the pawn on c4. But what can you play after this move? After knight c4? Rook c8 or rook c6. So, well, this rook has to protect there, so that's why I'm sure it's better to use this rook. Now the knight goes there, but you can play this move, and they can hardly defend the position. So, for example, here, rook e1 or rook b3 seems to be the solution. So let's say rook e1, and if rook e1 is played, then you push. So you sacrificed one pawn, but the b pawn is now closer. If you play it with rook c8, knight e3, and then rook c3, it's almost the same thing. But this time, well, if they play rook b3, for example, defending the position, you trade, they trade, it seems that the rook is not where it should be. However, you can try this move. Yeah, this move actually looks really good because now c2 is hanging. So they have to play bishop d1, it seems so. Rook b5 here, no, it's a blunder. So it's better to have the rook on b8, but I actually think that there is a very little difference between rook c8 and rook c6. It's mainly about the position of the rook. Well, no, rook c3 is played, so rook b5 and rook b8 is coming. So this can be the problem. Um, yes, because yeah, okay. Well, looks like a problem. So take this, king g7, take there, rook a3. I still think it's a winning position, but it's a bit hard to win. So doing with this rook is better. So this bishop d1, and here we can fork exactly. The same scenario happens if we first play rook c8, but rook b5 is a problem. That's right. That's why this rook should go to the c file. Anyway, they didn't take. Rook d1 was played, so rook goes back. Why? Well, to fight for the open file, there is nothing to do on f6. Rook d6, rook d8 trading. If, well, it was rook h6 played, this, and then knight g4. But if they play this move, how do we continue? Well, so neither rook e6 nor rook b8 doesn't work. I mean, doesn't help white to win a pawn because we can always put the rook behind and avoid a pawn loss. So even here or there. But in this position, I think it's better to take on g2. So this and then rook g8. And now the g2 pawn is lost. And once it's lost, it's over. So let's say rook a5. Well, I wanted to take with a rook originally, but this time it seems I have to take with a bishop. Yeah, good point about rook e2. So I think it works too because then what? If, for example, rook checks, there is a cross check and it's checkmate like that, for example. Or maybe the other rook goes to g2. So bishop g2, knight takes, and then it's a checkmate. What about instead of rook g8, rook e2? So this is what rook b6, rook d2, rook b5, and rook e2. Interesting. Yeah, I think it makes sense too. Yeah, it works. So that's why, in order to prevent this invasion, it was knight g4 played because e5 is hanging. However, it doesn't stop black. So black loses on e5, but after king e7, what next? So there is a rook e6, but after that, king goes back and no more checks can be delivered. So this captured and this bishop is hanging. Rook d6 is impossible. Knight f7 is a blunder. So bishop b1, saving. Rook b2, the bishop is trapped. They deliver a check. So king goes to d8, another check, king goes to c8, and this is where they didn't know what to do because this and this is hanging, so they played h4, and rook b1 was played. Well, rook g2 is interesting, but the king escapes to h3, and then how to play this? But it may not be enough because they push and then they try to escape with the king. Okay, fine. So rook b1, g4, but c3, and this pawn is promoted faster, or can be supported by the other pawn, and now they both can be promoted. So c2, b3, and c1. Fine. So this is how the game ended. So what do you think? Look at this position again. We have two really strong candidate moves. One was rook f4, with the idea of doing this, where you have to play with only one extra pawn, but it doesn't checkmate, so you are likely to experience some issues realizing material, or you have to play this endgame. What do you think is easier for you to realize? Especially when you are low on time. Definitely the endgame. It's much, much easier to win. Your task is just to not make serious blunders and follow the original plan, which is on the sure phase. So you have a pawn majority on the queen side. These pawns are already far advanced. So activate your rooks and advance your pawns. That's it. Okay. Fine. Let's continue. And I would like to show you a famous game between Anatoly Karpov and Joseph Dorfman. This game I also demonstrate on other workshops. I think I also included this game to one of our courses. Well, we are doing group lessons on Fridays, and there was one devoted to the attack. I think I did demonstrate this game, but we don't really need to analyze the middle game. We're talking about the end game and when it does make sense to pass the game to the end game, even if you are into the attack. Okay, so before we continue with this game, you can actually start thinking about the move for white here. I've already mentioned the objectives for you to pass the game to the end game. Now let's talk about the techniques to realize this advantage. So what you can do. In the end game, you can exchange the defenders of such some weak squares that you can move your pieces to or your pawns. You can, if this is not the end game and there are still queens on the board, it does make sense to exchange queens to avoid a perpetual check. And if you think you have advantage, especially if it's a material advantage, trade pieces. If you are trying to defend slightly worse in game, well, again, try to exchange enemy attacking pieces, mm, or even exchange pawns, because with fewer pawns on the board, sometimes your opponent may just not have enough material uh, to play for a win. So, for example, a rook and knight versus rook is a draw. Okay, so be careful with queen c2, guys. Yes, exactly. So bishop g2 and rook e1. d6 is interesting. I doubt about d6. It's interesting, but once you calculate it, you'll realize that it doesn't work so well. Bishop g2, queen f3. Well, queen f3 is a blunder. So bishop g2. Well, bishop g2 threatens to play d6. You can play so. You can play bishop g2, but I think they will react with rook c8 move. So d6 now means queen c2. F takes e5, another candidate move. F takes e5, yeah, but then still rook c8, and you can defend it, this time with a rook on h2, for example. So let's say they play queen e5. Does d6 work? Doesn't seem so. Well, maybe it does work. So d6, queen a2, d7, check. So bishop takes. Then c2 is not vulnerable, but how to continue? You can continue with queen a6. No, your IP is down. So even this number of pawns that you have is not enough. Queen e3. No, you cannot. Well, which queen e3? Queen a6, you mean? Yeah, I was thinking about queen e6, but what did you achieve? So you are down a piece. Okay. So, well, looks suspicious. Maybe d6 first. Black took the a2 pawn. Okay. Before black took. So this, then what? Rook h2. I play queen e5 and you play this move. So there is enough compensation? Because early in the middle game, Karpov sacrificed a piece for the attack. I don't think that white has much advantage here, to be honest. So d6, bishop d8. d7 is not an issue. There is no this move. So I doubt that white has advantage here. Maybe white is not losing here, but it's still fine. Okay, so why, by the way, why don't I want to play this move? Well, because this is a pin. Well, this is a pin. Also, it's a queen loss for two pieces, but still black has material advantage. And without queen, white's attacking potential is limited. Okay, so f takes e5, suspicious. d6, let's see how it works. So bishop d6, then what? F takes e5. I guess I can play this move. Rook e1, king of 8. If you take, I checkmate. If you defend there, with which move, by the way, then what? I can just save my bishop. It seems to be safe enough, if I'm not missing anything. So d6 also doesn't look good. Well, there was a good suggestion by one of our viewers on YouTube. He suggested to play bishop h3. Why so? Well, because bishop is not a piece that participates in the attack. This piece does create some danger. If we trade, we can also activate this rook, maybe move it here. Rook c8 was played anyway. F takes e5. So, well, here, for example, this is already a blunder. There is a pin. Doing this doesn't threaten to take on c2, so this. And after queen a5, there is nothing to worry about. Two pawns will allow white to win. Two pawns in the center. I mean, okay. So f takes e5, queen c4. So he wants to pass the game to the endgame. What do you think? Should we accept it or not? Okay, so Brian wants to say that two pawns on the third rank cost a rook, which is true. So, but the pawns on the fifth rank are not sufficient for white to play for a win. To draw the game, maybe yes, but not to play for a win. So that's why it looks unpromising to capture on c4 and then hope that d6, d7 works or e6 works. But we have a problem. The a2 pawn is hanging. Rook d3. Yeah, queen a2 is scary. So rook d3. Okay, but which rook d3 to avoid a queen exchange? What do you think? The h rook. Yeah, I think that's right. So the h rook. In the game, it was the d rook. Then the game continued with queen f4. So he didn't take on a2. If he took on a2, I think there was king d2 always. So d6, how does he play? Ah, and that's it. So this means d7. So he has to play this move to save the rook against d7 move. For example, rook c6. It can be something else too. Because queen a1, king d2 doesn't really improve the position much. And then we take on e7. But if we take on e7, they take on e7 with the king. Or, wait a sec, this. And there is a threat of rook c2. So that's why maybe instead let's try e6 or e6. Why e6? Well, because if f takes, there is queen h5. Let's talk about it a little later. If the queen takes, there is this move. And then rook e7, and this is much stronger than capturing with a pawn. Or you can even capture with a pawn and then threaten with rook d8. Queen e1 this time is not such a big issue. So king escapes, queen b2 fails. It fails because this is a check, and then you take on e7 with your queen, and it's almost checkmate. There will be checkmate later. You can the king escapes, you can push h5, and so on. Well, that's why they have to probably take on e6 with a pawn. And if they take on e6 with a pawn, let's decide. Queen h5. Queen h5 looks good because if the king goes there, then you can capture with a check and then you capture on h7. So he can play rook g6, but then you still capture on h7 and make two threats. And queen e1 is just a check. There is no second check to continue the attack. Because, for example, queen a1, this, and this doesn't look promising. How to continue? This, but rook takes. Bishop takes there, okay, queen g6, it's a winning position. Yeah, bishop takes, I would love to play this move, but no, it's under attack of the bishop. Okay, fine. So e6 would win. E6 would be a nice move. The game continued with queen f4, king b1, of course, and rook c4. He plays d6. Black plays rook e4. We block. White is fine with trading rooks because the attack is still strong. For example, rook a3, queen h4. And how you can continue? Don't forget that they are threatening with a back rank check, because if you trade the queens, you may lose the game. So just b3. Well, so one more thing, maybe one insight that you can learn from a FIDE master. When your opponents create a threat, you'd better defend against this threat and create your own threat. For example, when he attacks one of your pieces, you first should be looking of how to move this piece and at the same time gain a tempo. Otherwise, if you just move it, you lose a tempo. So b3 is a defensive move. If there is no better way, then yes, we should play b3 or maybe a3. But let's talk about how we can not only defend the back rank, but also make a threat to the enemy king. So queen f3, queen g2. Yes, this is the moves that I was talking about. I would prefer queen f3 here. Queen g2 should be fine too. Rook d3, well, rook d3, okay, so rook d3 is a tempo move. Well, queen h1, this is what you mean to play. But which threat does rook d3 create? What if, let's say, they take on g5? You take there, they take there with a queen. Is this endgame winning? No, it's not the endgame even. Is it winning? I doubt. Also, there is bishop g5, which I can hardly evaluate. There is this move, by the way. So if you take, check, rooks are traded, and then queen e7, and this is not winning. It's likely to be a draw. Fine. So he plays queen f3, defending h1 and attacking on a8. So queen g5, still threatening this. Now, in order to do some active actions with the queen, so just one check is not enough, because if we deliver a check, they just block on d8, and then what? Another check, but king escapes then. So first, he prepares his position and plays this move. The rook is not hanging, and he also covered the back rank. So queen g2. Queen e8 is no longer possible. If we trade the queens, again, we are not winning. It's 4 versus 4. Of course, our pawn structure is better, but it seems that this is not a decisive factor here. Instead, our e5 is a weakness, and they have a pass pawn on the h file, for example. Why not queen e5? Yeah, queen e5 fails. So, of course, if rook a5, it's rook g1 and we lose. But in this position, we have an intermediate check. We can play queen c6, not queen a8, but queen c6. And this move forces the king to make a move. So the king goes where? To f8 or d8? I think, okay, so it doesn't matter. Let's say, I think so many winning lines here. Okay, so let's say f8, it's safer for him. Then you can take there. If the king takes, then you capture on e5 as a check. If he escapes, then you capture on e5 and there is no backrank mate. If he captures with a queen, which seems to be the best move, there are several things you can do. The simplest is to do this, take there, and then take this queen. But there is also a better one, queen h6. If rook g7, then the rook is pinned, you simply take the queen. If king e8, then you take with a check, and this is a winning position too. Then you capture the pawns, or even this one. You can do the same strategy in case of king d8, but I also have a better solution. This, and check, after which you can take there at the very least, or you can still continue with this original plan, and after king g7, just simply take the queen. It's winning too, because if they take, you can promote your pawn to a new queen. So queen e5, well, doesn't work. By the first glance, it may seem logical because it weakens the back rank, but white has sufficient counterattack then. So queen g2, offering a queen straight. Queen f5, threatening to go there. Rook g6. Well, why don't they save their bishop, for example, to d8? What do you think? No, well, no, bishop f8, for example, is a blunder. It's obvious. But bishop d8, what about this move? Yeah, then we can play e6 and he's in a trouble. So while capturing leads to checkmate. No, the king escapes, but then we can make a discovered attack with a rook, so it's completely losing. But maybe he can play a... No, he cannot. If so, we take there and take the rook at least. Yeah, e6. So rook g6. He stops e6. Rook f1. This is a weakness now. So you see, if Karpov takes on e7, he simplifies the position. And it's easier for black than to escape with their king. By making these threats, he forces black to defend and looks for a better moment to, for example, pass the game to the endgame, to gain material and continue playing calmly, like positionally. Queen d5 was played in order to defend, and finally he takes. And what do you think about this position? So it's equal materially, but white is winning. What do you think? Because of which factors? While you are thinking, not only because of the pawn islands, but because of the king's position. The king is in a danger. So why after queen e5 he didn't play this move? I don't know. Maybe because of queen h7. I think queen g4 was a good move. Yeah, queen h7 then, and it's a bit unclear. Weak pawns and the enemy king is in the danger. So queen e4 attacking there, a5, logical, but the h pawn falls. The e5 may fall too, but if the e is captured, then there can be an attack through the open file. So king e8, queen h7. If they take there, they lose on f7. So that's why queen f3. Maybe not the best move, but at least it's a tempo gaining move. Check, king e7, another check, king e8. And queen goes that way. This is a tempo move too, because now rook f3 becomes a threat. Back rank weakness now is eliminated because the rook can move back to f1. And the second thing is that we are threatening with these checks, which will allow us at least maybe win a pawn. Or continue the attack by bringing the rook to the d file. A lot depends on where this queen moves. Queen moves to b7. So now neither queen c8 nor queen c7 can be played. That's why let's defend the back rank and continue the attack. So this is coming. Then the king is in a danger. So that's why he decides to take the pawn to provide the king with extra squares, like e5, e6, f6, and so on. But queen h4. Instead of queen b7. Wait. Where was it? So here. Instead of queen b7, was there rook c6? Um, no, I don't think it's so promising. I think the endgame is losing, first of all. Yeah, but there is queen b5 also. So rook f3, rook takes c4, and this seems to be losing. But no, well, maybe not actually. But let's talk about queen b5 because this is the most natural way how to play. Because now it's hanging, so the queen must move to e4 or g2. Let's choose e4. Then let's say, oh, this is hanging. Okay, so check. King moves to the 7th rank. Another check. Even if the king moved there, rook c7 becomes impossible because there is a queen. And then I take on f7. And if the king goes that way, then I can, instead of taking on f7, I can play this. How does it work? King goes back. I can deliver a check with my queen. King goes that way. Queen d8, king e6, and then what? Queen here, yeah, probably. Queen d8, queen e6, king. Well, I was just calculating it. And this is a winning position.
I think queen f6 mates there after king
There is a
e6. No,
there is a
king's on
yes,
e6.
good point. Good point. This, yeah, good point. Queen f6 was made. So no. Rook c6 doesn't work. Okay, queen b7. And this check, and the king is now in the danger, and we can bring our pieces to attack his weaknesses as well as the king's position. So check is completely useless. Just king b2, and what then? Rook a7, queen f5, this queen a5. So another extra pawn. So, well, why this? To avoid future checks and to play this move. But at every stage of this final part of the game, white is ready to play the end game. If b4 falls, it's a completely losing position. So this was played queen c8, king d5, and queen c4 leads to a checkmate. How does it lead to a checkmate? For example, king d6 is the only move, then rook d8, and the only square is this, and then you can do that. So he plays there, another check, and now finally the king. Okay, no, if this, there is a checkmate, but if this move, what you can do is only. Okay, so I thought you can win the queen. You can trade the queens here. Okay, let's go back. So it's this, king is 7, queen c7, king is 6. Oh, just take the queen here. So what I'm talking about. So check, and then just win the queen. That's it. And then you can checkmate as you wish. Okay, fine. So what you may learn from this game fragment. Well, first of all, this feature, when your pieces are under the attack or when your opponent creates a threat, try to parry this threat and at the same time gain a tempo, especially if you are doing the attack. This helps you to speed up such an attack. And at every stage of your plan, think about the position, how it looks once the queens are gone. So if you pass the game to the end game, how can you evaluate the position? Is your material advantage enough? Is your positional advantage enough? Here, with the bishop on e7 being alive, it seemed that it was too early for white to convert to pass the game to the end game. But once the bishop is gone, like that, and the h pawn is uh, fallen, then it is possible to pass the game to the end game already. However, this time with the king being on e7, it does make sense to keep material on the board. But of course, Karpov couldn't calculate all these checks. So he was ready to pass the game to the end game at a certain moment. And then he thought that with a pawn majority on the queen side, he has better chances. Let's continue.
Victor, can I ask you a quick question before you
Mhm.
go there? In that position where you had like a 4-on-3 and you traded the queens, it would be a rook ending with 4-on-3. Would you feel confident to still win that rook ending, or is that
Uh,
too
if
close to
it,
call?
Uh, so it depends on the enemy pawn structure. Here I see that a5 is a weakness, and this probably can become a decisive factor that tells that white is winning. But it depends. For example, if the enemy king in that endgame comes to c6, then a5 will be protected and I may not win. I would win if, let's say, the e pawn was not in the center but was the edge pawn, like on the H file. Let's say 3 versus 3 and an edge pawn, or the G pawn, for example. 3 versus 3 on one flank and a pass pawn on the other flank. I would win, especially if I could locate the rook behind that pawn.
What about if the rooks went and it was a queen and pawn endgame?
A lot depends on the king's position because there is a high risk of a perpetual check.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Uh,
Yeah, further, I think let's say you were to trade all the pawns off the board and it was both sides had their rooks and there's one extra pawn. Then I think you need at least three files between the enemy king and that pawn
so
in order to guarantee it a win.
you mean to cut the king off to not let him to blockade the pawn? So
Like let's saying your pawn was on the H file, the king would need to be like on the D or E
yeah,
or D
that
file.
that's right. That's right. Uh, so yes, you're right. So I have to cut the enemy king, but with more pawns, I'm likely to create a distant passed pawn and win because of that. Well, a lot again depends on the king's activity. Here, it's too early to say, well, if we remove the queens, it's too early to say that white is winning, for example. At the same time, I cannot say that it's drawing. Okay, fine. So the next example, this. Again, it was Alexander Aleking playing against, I don't know who is this player, Ladros Telos. The game was played in 1931, so it seems that uh, Aleking was probably on his peak at that moment. However, somehow he got this slightly unpleasant position from the opening, and his king is under the attack. What do you think here Alexander Aleking should do to not lose the game? What would you suggest? Okay, so Brian thinks it can be knight e7 to secure your king's position. Well, on the one hand, it's logical. On the other hand, it seems to be too passive. Then suggest knight b4, error suggest knight b4. So knight b4 seems more attractive than knight e7, because knight e7, there is nothing concrete, it's not a blunder, but let's say just king b2, and step by step I will try to realize material advantage. It's extra pawn for white. But it definitely should be something, because, well, rook d5 is a threat. The e pawn is pinned. And if it's possible to sacrifice the rook for that pawn, then two other major pieces will deliver a checkmate. That's why this, queen d6. Now, where the queen goes, this is crucial. For example, if the queen goes to c7, this leads to checkmate. So this, king goes to d8, and they have to sacrifice the queen and then get checkmated. So knight b4 is a good move. Well, knight c3 is the second option, but there was something I didn't like about knight c3. So let's say I double the rooks and threaten with this move. Okay, so let's get here. So knight b4 was played, rook goes to d6, queen goes to c5. Why the queen goes to c5? Well, this time rook e6 doesn't work. The king escapes, and white doesn't know how to continue the attack. Well, they can do this move, but what then? Looks like the queen is well placed and can successfully defend the king's position. What do you think white should do? Centralize the knight on d4. So centralizing the knight is actually a good idea. Also, is there a threat on c2? Looks like not, because just any random move, just to illustrate it, this leads to a queen straight, and then the knight is lost, simply. Okay, so if knight d4 blunders knight d3, that's right. Good point. So what can white do? It seems that white is stuck with their attack, but because they still have extra pawn, they can pass the game to the endgame. What do you think? What's the best way for white to do this? Should white capture, or should white play something else and let black capture on e5? No, well, rook e6, well, we did talk about rook e6 then. Rook e6 this time fails because the king escapes to c7. Okay, queen e6, but wait, then the king escapes there, so you cannot support your attack. Is there a perpetual check? Yeah, it seems so. Rook f6, rook g6, rook h6 is a perpetual check. But white is much better in this position. Why should play for win? King b2, yes, king b2 is an option. I agree. What else? Well, this move. Why? Because if the queens are traded in this position, all white pieces become so active, then king b2. So there is also knight d7, knight f6 idea. Because knight d7 leads to this. Otherwise, if rook g8, for example, knight f6 is a fork. That's why rook g8 should be played right away. Then f4 supporting, and f6, for example, means to hang the pawn there. So the knight is well placed. Both rooks are active, occupying the only open file. And a6 is still the object of the attack. So white would win probably if they did so. But they traded the queens right away, thinking that, okay, I'm a pawn up, I should be winning. And why did Ally King pass the game to the endgame, which was completely losing? Well, the only reason is that in this position, he cannot coordinate his pieces. And if he didn't trade the queens, he would fall under a mating attack. Sooner or later, rook e6 would work and he would lose the game. That's the reason. So that's why that was a must. And well, of course, this to not blunder knight d3 or not tie the rook to c2. King e7. Rook goes to b6. White is still completely winning. Knight comes to e5. Rook goes there to add some pressure, but there is a check. And now if black doesn't want to lose on f7, they have to block. Because, for example, king e8, which seems to be possible, leads to what? Maybe it leads to this move. Rook c2, rook c2. If the knight takes, it's a fork. So rook takes, king goes to b1, and we are threatening to take on b4, and then take this. Maybe it's not bad, because rook f2 can be played. Okay, let's go back. Knight if so if, for example, king goes to e8, let's defend it. Let's defend it not by doing c4, because if so, it's this. Yeah, let's play knight c4. I think it works fine because there is a check there. a5 can be attacked. Yeah, okay, so that's why rook c7 was played and the pair of rooks was exchanged. So g3, f6, knight goes there, and e5. Rook goes to d2, and Alexander Aleking wanted to compensate a material loss, a pawn loss, with his piece's activity. That's why he plays king e6. So this king finally became a powerful piece. Knight e1, knight d5. c4, they try to chase it away, but knight e7. The knight can later go to d4, for example, through f5 or through c6. King goes to a3, and here he plays a risky but finally working maneuver with his pieces. What would you suggest for black here? So it's still losing endgame, but this time it's not completely losing. There can be some chances. Knight c4 earlier was a good move, probably. But knight c4 earlier would face with pawn to a4. Knight goes to d4 through c6. Good point, but if you play so, won't they just play knight c2? And then rook d5? So let's say you start with knight c6, they play knight c2, and their next move is this. Could white play rook d6? Okay, so Zamfir suggests king f5 myth. Nice. Let's talk if there was a possibility of playing rook d6. So e5, rook d2, king e6. No, there was no invasion. There is invasion of this move, but then you blunder the pawn on c2 at least. Even two pawns. Knight e1, knight d5. No, there is no invasion, so you couldn't play it. Well, in this position, you could play this. Rook d8. But is it so beneficial? Well, let's say a4. This, no, well, king b4 is a blunder. So knight d3 maybe. And check, and maybe rook a1 then. Rook c8, it should be a draw. So if we trade rooks, we are likely to lose because they have an outside passed pawn. The knight can hardly fight against the edge pawn because the knight being on the edge has only few squares to escape. So it's losing. If we trade rooks, it's losing. Black shouldn't trade rooks. But with rooks, it's possible to play for a draw here. Anyway, so yeah, rook d8 was possible, but again, there is no invasion. Rook d8 is an invasion, but it's not promising. So king a3 and king f5 was played. So the king goes that way. Rook d6, finally this was played. Knight goes there. It stops this move. It also allows us to play knight d4 in future. Knight c2, and here Alekin takes risk and goes with the king to e4, sacrificing this pawn. What was his idea? His idea was that with this move, he can create a passed pawn. For example, if knight d4, pawn takes d4. It was actually still fine. For example, this, rook d3, rook d6, king c3, king a4, d3. So you can take d2, and 5 pawns are stronger than a rook. So there is always a chance to sacrifice. But yeah, don't make such mistakes like rook a6. So there is a common trick. They distract your rook and then they promote. This is where black can draw the game. Yeah, h4. That's right, h4. And at a certain moment, you will promote your pawn either the h or the c, because in this position just c6 and the rook cannot fight against two pawns. After the c7, c8, they have to sacrifice it and you can promote the h. The king is too far from the place of action, and even if the king was on g4, stopping the pawns on the king side, there is the second pawn on the b file, which allows white to win anyway. Fine. So that's why after knight d4, they didn't take. Oh, actually, they should take, but they made another mistake and played king b2. Now, let's decide what you should do. What do you think? Well, king d3. It's interesting. King d3 is interesting, but I think it can be this. And they aim to play f4 to weaken the position of the knight. No, wait, it's white to move here. So rook d6, and there is no knight c2. You mean knight c2, king c2 in this position, and then a4. Right, but you can play a4 right away, because if this, you're fine, because you create a passed pawn. And still, it's the best option. It's risky, but it's still the best option. Well, d3 always fails, because there is a possibility to locate the rook behind. I even think that after d3, it's better to play this move. The king goes away, and can we play this? Just then rook d7, and I want to avoid this move. Okay, maybe too risky. Okay, so this b takes a4, and if d3, let's play something more simple like that. No, something like that, and then king d2. Yeah, and then promote your pawns or take on h6 at least. The king can successfully stop the pawns. There is f3 planning and a5 and rook h6, so it should be winning. But if you play king d3, then it's not so obvious. Probably white is still ahead if he plays a5, but well, this is quite complex. But this is even worse. After a takes b3, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and then he takes there, it's almost the same position, but the pawns are already exchanged. So again, d3 this time is a mistake. Check, king goes back, and then king c3, king d2. That's why Ellie King plays king d3. Rook f3, king goes to e2, aiming to promote a pawn. Rook f4, and what do you think they should play in this position? So if you black, how would you play? Rook d7, fine. King d2 and king d2. Okay, let's talk about it. So rook d7, rook f4. And if you take there, it's king c2. And then at least they don't lose. So king here, king d3, king h2. So rook d4 is the best option. Yeah, rook d4 seems to be enough. Because if rook takes king g3, it's already c5, and white promotes much faster. Well, if you don't take, but let's say you save like that, then this pawn is too far. So they play g4. No, rook g4, what is better? Maybe rook g4 is better. Maybe rook g4 is better, and then they try to promote this pawn with the king. So black is losing. Okay, maybe king f3 should be played instead. Hmm. Okay, so it seems that king f2 was a mistake, and instead it should be played king d2, d3, and so on. This is likely to lead to a draw. So this, even king d1, I think. c5, d3, c6. This, if king comes closer to take on d3, it's d2. This, and this is a draw because interesting. So if this move I'm threatening to promote, and if this move there is a check. So black is winning even. This. So king c3 first, d2, and then c6. And after this move, it's this, because if the king goes that way, there is a check. If the king goes that way, there is king d3, which is also a check. So, for example, this line, check, the king either goes back or otherwise he loses a pawn. Well, this is a possibility too, but then check this and this. So, and after rook c6, because of the king's position, it should be a draw. 1 versus 2, but this king is too far. Well, actually, 2 versus 1, even if the kings are well placed, should be a draw anyway. So rook e4, king goes to d1, and it's a repetition. Okay, so white can draw the game. And the best scenario for black is to play rook d7 and king d1. It works. Or it can be king d3, threatening to take the c pawn. So rook f3, king a2. Rook goes to f4, and then what? Again, if you play this move, there is a check. No, there is king c3, and after d2, there is a check. And after this move, there is this. So that's why in this position, rook d7 is a must. And then d2 and so on. So it's a draw. This is how Alexander Alekhine could draw the game. Yeah, king d3 repeating the moves. Yes, the cleanest win was to play rook knight takes d4 earlier when there was a chance to get 5 pawns for the rook. But I think just not accepting this queen straight, but playing this move was sufficient. Because now it's even a threat of doing rook d8, distracting the rook and capturing there. Can black avoid the queen straight here? No. Like knight d5, rook takes d5. Can they move the queen away to escape? No, I doubt. For example, where the queen can go to avoid a trade of the queens. Well, queen c7 still blunders rook e6. Now queen e7 is the only move, but it blunders the rook and white is winning. Queen a7, still the same story. And the rook is hanging. So that's why after this move, it seems that the best thing that black can do is to exchange the queens himself, and then white has a total domination on the board. That was the cleanest way. But if for example, here Alekhine doesn't play this and trade the queens, he will lose, and he would lose in like 10 moves maybe. So that's why he had to play so. He had to pass the game to the endgame to avoid more serious problems. In the endgame, he still struggled, but because he was a great chess player and his endgame technique was also very good, he thought that he could have some chances there. If not to win the game, at least to draw. And yes, he was right. He outplayed his opponent in the endgame. But in the middle game, it was so scary to play this position, and he was very likely to lose. Okay, fine. So we have one more example before we finish. And I also would like to let you know that our workshops are free. However, if you like this content and you would like to support, there is a link that allows you to donate through PayPal. I can send you the link here in the chat. So let me explain how it works, and then we will continue with the next example. So you just click on this button, a new pop-up window appears. You enter the amount that you want to donate. It can be any amount. And then you click a PayPal button. It redirects you to enter to PayPal to enter your account. Then you enter it and transfer money automatically to my account. I would appreciate any help because your support helps me to plan my uh, workshops better, as well as to pay for my assistants who help me to prepare content. Okay, here we are. The next example, the last one, this game. So what can you say about this game? It's black to move at the moment. Who is better, white or black? Yeah, white is crushing. because of these two bishops, the king is in such a danger. So, what do you think black can do to not lose the game? Okay, so white looks to have okay, trade the bishop and queens. Well, if it's possible, yes. It's generally speaking, but what concrete idea you suggest? Trade the rook for one of the bishops. Okay, Carlos, I think actually you're right. We should trade, but which rook and which bishop we should eliminate? Doing like that means that we are still a pawn down and the bishops are of the same color, plus there is a pressure through the f file, so a pin that they can potentially exploit. Also, I think they can consider taking with a queen and entering our camp. Maybe it's not such a big problem, so but f takes d5 is a real problem. So that's why it should be a different bishop. Or we should eliminate such a bishop by doing this exchange, bishop e6, even at the cost of a pawn. King goes to f7. So what can he do now? If he trades, we are fine. If he plays bishop c6, which makes a lot of sense, there is rook d1, and this rook d1 allows us to deliver a perpetual check. So this, how do they defend the position? Maybe queen f2? It's even possible to lose. For example, this. Okay, so queen g1 leads to a draw. Queen f3, queen d1. King g2. Queen e2. Yeah, queen e2 works, because if they play queen f2, it's bishop h3. So king g3, queen g4 is checkmate. If king g1, it's this. King h1 also drops the queen. Fine. So yes, there is a perpetual check. That's why that was a possibility. It's very hard to calculate it, and instead, black plays also a powerful move. He sacrifices material back just to eliminate this danger. And he also has in mind the idea that by liquidating this light squared bishop, which is definitely stronger than the dark squared one, if we are talking about the enemy attack on our king, we pass the game to the middle game with bishops of the opposite color. And probably instead of just defending our king's position, we can try to attack the enemy king. What do you think? Or in case if we pass the game to the end game, we have bishops of opposite color, which provides us with better chances to draw the game. Especially having in mind that most of white pawns are on light squares. So c takes d5 was played. Queen g6, threatening with this. Rook e1. Rook d8 attacking the pawn. I don't actually think that this is an attack because there is bishop d6 and queen e8. But at some point the pawn will be hanging. So d6. There is still extra pawn for white. Don't forget about it. c5 is hanging. Capturing c5 right away, I think wasn't so promising For example, king g8, and then what? So looks like you have to retreat. But if you retreat, you lose on d5. If you try to save there, it's this, and you have to sacrifice exchange, and this is where black definitely survives. So d6 was played. c5 is still a weakness. But d5, yeah, d5 means that the pawn is already on a dark square and light squares are open. That's why we can use the bishop. So bishop here, so coming to c8. Well, bishop c8 I think was also possible. But this time queen c5 doesn't work neither because we have this. Rook c8 first and then bishop c6. If we started with bishop c8, then queen c5, it still works. Bishop b7 just. Yeah, bishop c8 works. So queen g3, offering a trade. What do you think black should play? Trade or not? Okay, after bishop d7, is there a sacrifice there? No, because, well, if you take with, I think you can even take with the king, but you can take with the queen and what sacrifice on e7? Oh, you mean this? Yeah, that makes sense. But okay, let me play a better move. Let me play this move. Because bishop c6 leads to mate. And if queen g3 right now, I can trade the queens and then take on g7. So, well, rook g1 fails. Maybe queen f3 works to cover the diagonal. If so, at least I have rook c8 and this. So it's still a problem. Well, taking with the king makes sense too, because after that, if the king escapes to h6, well, there is a repetition. But if this, then you lose. So that's why even here, bishop g7, they don't win. At least they don't lose with a repetition. So this, queen e7, king g7, queen e7, and if queen h5, it's queen f6, and still a repetition. Rook g1. When? In this position, you cannot play rook g1. It's bishop c6. No, rook g1 doesn't work, sorry. Or you mean after that, rook g1 still fails. So queen g3. Well, we can trade, and it's actually the best way, the simplest and the best way to play. But then David Bronstein would have to defend his position. And, well, he improved the pawn structure for white. King f7, king g2. And I think it's still a draw, but it's really hard to win, to draw this game. Because this, then f5, the king comes closer. So it's possible. The c5 is a weakness. It's possible, but it's really hard to equalize here. Accurate play is required. But with queens, it's riskier. But there is always the idea to invade the enemy camp and do a perpetual check. That's why here he prefers to keep the queens on the board. King g1, rook e8, making a pin. So f5 finally was played. So why f5 was played? Because opening the f file guarantees rook f1 and then black experiences issues. Which issues? So, well, queen f5 loses right away. Bishop f5 loses too, because after this move, it's this, bishop g7. And if queen g7, it's rook e8. And if king g8 in this position, it can be so I don't know, bishop here. Or bishop there. Maybe bishop there. Because if queen g6, it's rook e8. Bishop g6 is the only move. But then I suggested playing this line and here. So why here? Because I eliminate checks and threaten mate. In order to defend, they have to play queen f7 and not queen d7, because queen d7, queen f6. Right? So threatening here and there. And queen f7 leads to a no, it doesn't lead to a loss. Okay, so queen f7, check. Queen e8. Okay, no. Sorry, there is not enough advantage. I think I made a mistake somewhere. Oh yeah, here, this move. And if queen blocks, it's d7 simply because it's pinned. If bishop f7, what do you think? Well, I like queen f4 move because I'm threatening with queen f5 then. I'm threatening with queen f6. And queen g4 is not such a big problem because after king f2, simply no checks if my queen is on f6, for example. Okay, so bishop f5, it can be bishop g7, and this wins a better position, almost a winning position. So that's why they play g6 here. Well, why g6? Well, trying to get rid of it in case if pawn takes. Then I think queen takes works. Queen takes, check, king goes there. And once the queens are traded, this time there are no dangerous pawn here or there, and the king doesn't come to the place of action quickly. Moreover, at the moment there is a bishop hanging on e5. Or even this, because after this move there is bishop f7. This is a little risky because dark squares are open around the king, but still seems to be sufficient. Queen f4, let's say. Uh, well, queen d5 doesn't work. Queen h7 maybe. Okay, well, it's hard to play. It's better to take here with the queen and avoid such problems. So f6 was played. And queen e6 makes a pin. Bishop c3 becomes possible, but then queen d5 and bishop c6. So that's why here queen h4, threatening with queen h6 and queen g7. Now let's decide how you can successfully draw the game here. h5 or what? Queen g4? h5 may not work so well because of queen g5 and they still threaten to invade your camp. But queen g4 should work. So here, passing the game to the endgame when this pawn is already advanced make a lot of sense because we can set a blockade. So king f2, king f7, and we can successfully locate one of our pieces on e6 and stop two pawns. Bishop b2, because the bishop was vulnerable. This is our only weakness, but after a rook straight, we don't really have to care much about that pawn. Maybe there was a better way for them to play. For example, bringing the king to g3. If so, bishop d2, king goes to f4, and I think that bishop c6 was okay. Just h6 is fine. Just h6, and if he does so, then it can be g5, and after king f4, it can be this. So in order to not lose the bishop, he has to keep his king there, but then it's a perpetual check. Well, repetition. So bishop b2 was played, the rooks are traded, and then it's easier to hold these pawns. King d7 would lose the game, by the way. This, you... No, 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 no. No, it doesn't lose the game. So this, it's still possible to go back and stop the pawn. But this move wasn't played, maybe because of bishop f5. And then the bishop becomes poisoned. Yeah, but you can first play bishop d7, bishop e8, and only then continue with king e6, or even king e6 in this position. Bishop e5, now you can play bishop e8. But even if you play bishop e8, the bishop is poisoned. So for example, bishop e8, let's say they play a random move, you take, then f7, and then d7, and they promote. So the bishop is poisoned anyway. That's why you have to play something else after bishop a5. And here, black wants to minimize the number of pawns and continues with this move. So with a4 in future, king goes to c3. He can try this, why not? But he decides to play bishop b5, simply because he doesn't want the king to come to c4. It provokes this, bishop e8 anyway, and now bringing the king there doesn't help. Why doesn't it help? Because now the bishop becomes hanging. So you can take it, and if this, there is intermediate check which allows you to win a pawn on f7. The white doesn't promote. Moreover, white is a piece down then. So bishop g3, they lose the pawn on f6, but still want to bring the king to c4. However, black can easily draw the game in such a case. What do you think? How? This time you can see this the way of how to build a kind of a fortress. King d5. With king d5, you are missing d7 and f7. King d5. Okay, so king d7, I think. Just king d7. Bishop f7. Bishop f7, they just move there, and you lose the pawn on c5. However, if you
Then you
start
gain the
with...
one on b3 though, right? After the king moves, you go king
Mm,
d7 after, and then captured one on b3, right?
so which pawn do you take? You move d7 or take on f6?
I would go d7 because if you go,
7.
yeah,
Good.
take.
What about the a pawn?
I mean, how is that different than the d7 first? That's what I'd like to see because isn't that the same where you're headed?
No, if you move to d7 first, after king c4, you can play king c6.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
And then there is bishop f7 check. So for example, which pawn they attack? Well, this pawn, it doesn't make sense to attack this pawn. It's just bishop f7 check, and then you can take on d6. So they should attack this pawn, but then you can still deliver a check, and the king has to move. If the king moves there, he blocks the bishop, and you just take on d6. If the king goes there, then let's take this pawn. He takes that pawn, and you take this. A4 falls, and f7, king of e7 stops the pawn. So you're not losing here. You're not winning, of course, but not losing. if they start with this move to threaten with f7. Well, then king e6 first. And just king d7. Just king d7, and now what? The bishop has to move. f7 is a blunder of the f7 pawn. The bishop has to move, and then you can take on e4, and this is a draw. So king d7, king c6, and this is a fortress. He plays king b2 to avoid this forced variation. King goes to e6, and well, instead of repeating the position, he tried to deviate from that line, but then just c4, and a4 is lost with a check, so it forces a draw. So this, take, king takes which pawn? f6. I think any pawn. Then this. And well, if he takes this, he actually loses, because these two pawns are too far from each other. But let me explain. So I will explain in this case, and then you'll realize why it was necessary to take the f pawn instead of the d pawn. Then bishop c7. So we create a passed pawn. Well, this means we can always play that. So it stops bishop c6, but g3, take, and then this. And now they have to sacrifice, they have to play this move and sacrifice a pawn on d7. So h2, d7. So bishop takes on d7, bishop takes there. And this is a winning position. This is a winning position for white. It should be, because a7 is coming also. But because even these two pawns are too far from each other. But so if we play bishop d7, we can not lose. So a7. What do you think how to play? Looks like here black is able to save the game with only moves. Bishop c6 here. Yeah, here bishop c6 draws the game. Bishop c6, king c6, for example, is a blunder. Because even a8 promoting first, but h1 and the queen is hanging. d7 fails too. d7 check, and then king takes d7. So then black is winning. But black played some adventurous chess already. So instead, they could not sacrifice there and build a kind of a fortress with these moves and trying to push the pawn, and the king would have to go back, or the bishop would have to go to do this. So bishop c6, king d7 would guarantee a draw, because the pawns are close to each other, so white would lose both in order to win this bishop. But then, well, this will be okay. Anyway, so I actually think that this may work. No, this doesn't work, right? Because then d7. In this concrete position, it doesn't work. So you can take, but then g2. But then, I mean, a7, and after this move, no, they just take here. So they just take there, and then a7, and then they promote. Okay, fine. So h3 is better, and then with bishop c6, we were able to draw the game. The game continued with g5, king d7, so finally he makes a fortress. And the bishop has to move. It cannot actually. G6 was played, H2, G7, H1, G8. And then they agreed to a draw because of a perpetual check. So in order to avoid this perpetual check, he played this. And yeah, this is the fortress that I wanted you to demonstrate. The bishop on C6, the king on D7. So what white is doing, he makes moves on this diagonal with his bishop, because this king cannot do anything. In order to promote, the king should be on b8. But he cannot go there because this king holds a successful blockade. So just bishop h1, bishop c6, or bishop a8, or b7, it's a draw anyway. Okay, fine. So, well, in these two previous examples, black passed the game to the endgame to not lose. And here, well, capturing on g3 was possible early, but that would increase the white's chances to win compared to this position when the pawn was already advanced to f6, and it was easier to hold two pawns together by occupying e6 square with the king. So this is what you may keep in mind when you are in the danger. If they attack your king's position, think about the endgame. The G pawn queens with check. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so fine. So we are done for today. There will be a workshop next Sunday. Do you have any questions? If not, let's finish and hope to see everyone next Sunday. Okay, bye bye.